Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you to another installment of Open Air presented by the Harvey B. Gantt Center in Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm Dexter Wimberly, and I'm very excited about today's guest. Excited as ever. Stacy Utley is a critically acclaimed visual artist and arts educator who experiments with various media. His work addresses various topics that are important within the African American community. Utley is a graduate of the North Carolina State University College of Design, where he received a bachelor's degree in architecture. He then went on to receive a Master of Fine Art from Lesley University College of Art and Design in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Utley has exhibited his work internationally, including the 2021 Venice Architecture Biennale, as a result of his collaboration with Evoke Studio. Utley's work can be found in private and public collections, including North Carolina State University and Johnson C. Smith University. Utley has been awarded projects from the city of Raleigh, North Carolina, the Arts and Science Council in North Carolina, and the Durham County Public Arts Commission. He has been a finalist in 2 international calls for entries, the UNCC Charlotte Remembrance Memorial in Charlotte, North Carolina, and the I Am a Man Plaza in Memphis, Tennessee. Both projects were collaborative works with local artists and design firms. Utley's work was part of the Gantt Center's recent show, My Presence is Present, an exhibition curated by Carla Aaron Lopez that navigated through surreal African-American experiences as told by 20 emerging and established contemporary artists around the Carolinas. Please join me in welcoming Stacy Utley to today's conversation.
Hey, thank you. Thank you very much. Good to see you.
Good to see you as well. Good to see you as well. I hope that I'm coming through loud and clear and that I'm framed okay in this screen. Sometimes a little hard to tell on my end. So I gave an introduction, which included obviously a bio that you shared with us. But I'd love for you to just take a moment and talk a little bit about the work that you do and the things that you're really interested in right now as it relates to your artistic practice.
Sure. So the work that I'm working on right now is a series of paintings, and I kind of work in 2 veins. So I work as a 2D artist, but I also work as a public artist as well. And there's definitely a relationship in both of the works that I do, but in particularly with the works that we're going to look at tonight, the 2D, the paintings that I've done, These works are really talking about communities that are in transition. As you said, I've had a background. I have a background. I started my career working as an architectural intern. I graduated from NC State with a degree in architecture, and I worked as an intern for firms, both locally and also in other cities. And the conversation of gentrification and urban planning and communities in transition has always interested me, probably since the very beginning when I was kind of first introduced to it. And so I started kind of exploring that in my work. I started exploring it from communities that I knew, um, that my family lived in. And then as I relocated to other cities and then relocated to Charlotte, it's kind of still hearing the same stories and the same narratives. And so my work has really been addressing that. And so this body of work that we're looking at tonight, one piece that was in the show at the Gantt Center, is really talking about that. And I try to incorporate elements from architectural elements that from renderings, from that time of studying, incorporating those elements into the work as well. But it's work that I've been very passionate about, work that I plan on continuing to kind of push to, I don't know necessarily to find an answer, but I think for my own kind of understanding, and hearing the narratives from so many people, it's work that planning on continue doing.
So you mentioned something about hearing some of the similar stories in different communities and from different families. Can you talk a little bit about what those stories are as it relates to the concerns of your work?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one thing that I would definitely go back to, that I kind of reference a lot, and it is when I was in grad school and I was working on my body of work. In my mind, I thought I was going to just, I was going to create these. I started out as a collage and mixed media artist, and one day I was in a community here in Charlotte, and I was going to collage on a white foam house that I kind of created, and the house has kind of always been been something, that a theme that's kind of carried through my work. When I was in school, they said, don't deny the fact that you studied architecture. Incorporate that into your art. And so I started by making these massing models of just like a regular house, a white house, foam core, just showing the shape and the shape and size of it. And so I was in Cherry, historic Cherry, and that was a neighborhood that was going through a lot of transition at the time. And I remember getting out the car and I was walking around because I was going to find discarded material, things that may have been left behind. I was going to use that to kind of collage on top of the house. And there was a woman there. This was around the holidays. There was a woman there, and she saw me carrying the house, and because I was trying to find the appropriate size pieces. And she asked me, she asked what was that I was carrying. I said, well, it's just a model that I'm carrying. And her first response was, "Is that what they're going to build here?" And it took me a minute to see what she was really asking me, but she was like, "Is that the next thing? Is that what they're going to build here? Because I'm renting this house, and I've been asking the landlord, if you are going to sell this property, I need time so I'm not displaced. I need to find a place for a good school. I need to find a place where I can get to work, where I can get my kid to school. I just need to know ahead of time." And what I didn't realize is that she had been watching me kind of carrying this house around. And I didn't realize that, she had been watching me and was like texting neighbors. So they were like kind of texting each other, and this was like back in 2014. And so I said no. I was like, I'm getting my MFA, and this is my work that I'm doing. And it just opened up a conversation. But just carrying that around was something that was so crazy. I didn't realize that was like kind of triggering, for her. And so she was just talking about how much transition the community has gone through, and telling me that I should talk to some other people in the community. And I actually went that same day. It was a gentleman that lived maybe 3 doors down. She said, you need to go talk to him. He's been living here for 30 years. And so I was like, well, okay, I just figured I'm out here. Let me go out here and talk to him. So I remember I went and knocked on his door, and he wouldn't open the door. He just kept yelling from the other side, "I'm not selling my house. I'm not selling my house." And I was like, this is the craziest, like it was crazy because my work was going in one direction, but that whole experience kind of made it go in another. And so that would just kind of, it was just really, just to kind of hear, for him yelling on the other side of the door, it made me think, how many times has people come to his door asking about buying his property? How many letters has he gotten, in the mail for offers to buy his house? And so I went back a couple of weeks, just kind of spent time in that community, and I ran into somebody the next day. They were actually bulldozing the houses across the street. And the lady was like, "I just talked to my neighbors like 2 weeks ago. They said nothing about moving." And so, it was just those type of stories. And then even, like for, talking to my grandfather, he talks about, he gets letters all the time about in Raleigh, about wanting to buy his property. And so he has stacks of letters of people just interested in buying his property, people get, making cash offers. And it's that question of, what do I do? Do I sell? Do I stay? Is this the right amount of money? I don't want to leave my home. I've worked so hard to get it. And so, it's just those type of stories that you hear. And the work that I did at that time, I really called it Any City America, because it was happening basically in any city. That it was that these same narratives, these same stories were happening. So that body of work that I did back in 2014 started out as a photo series that kind of led to the work that I'm doing now.
And thank you for sharing that. And so it leads me to think about a couple of other things that I wanted to unpack with you today. So
Sure.
are there any personal events in your own life that sort of led you to be so deeply concerned with matters of gentrification and there's obviously a deep community orientation in your work, and I'm curious to understand, like, where did that come from?
Um, yes, in a way. So growing up, my father was military, so when I was really little, we moved around a lot. But the roots of where my family were in Raleigh, the community that that they lived in, still live in, some of them. Was going through a lot of transition, and some of them were living in low income housing, where they were coming through saying that we're going to build a new community here, and we'll give you the first offer to want to get back into it. And so you would hear those kind of stories, and so it's like, well, are you going to do it? It's like, no, like I'm not going to be able to afford it when this happens. And so from a personal aspect of it, from a family wise, yeah, you hear a lot of those stories. And then, as I mentioned before, I was working for a firm in Raleigh when I was working as an intern. And I remember our first conversation. This was a black-owned firm, keep in mind, and there was an opportunity to design a. This was in Raleigh, something very similar to the Harvey Gantt Center, but it was in Raleigh, and it was on a property that it was right now, it was a surface parking lot, but it had multiple owners. And so I remember when we go into that meeting. This is like my first meeting. I'm all excited, had on my new suit and everything, and I'm sitting in the back, and they're presenting, this was very conceptual. So nothing had been planned, nothing had been sold, any of that. This was just to get community buy-in. And that was really, I was sitting in the back listening to people, and they were upset because apparently, things like this had happened before, in terms of wanting to buy the property, or things that, stories, different, they would say different tactics to try to get them out of that property that they owned. And I'm sitting in the back, I'm like, what are they talking about? Like, what is this conversation about? Like, we're building something for, for the community, but there was a history there in terms of what those people have been through. And so just kind of being in the back and just kind of like hear, ear hustling, if you will, listening to stories. It was just kind of like where I was like, okay, this is a conversation that I've heard kind of with my, with family members. Now I'm hearing this amongst, another community. And so those kind of things really, that's kind of where it really kind of started for me, and just kind of continued on. And I think I had to kind of navigate those two worlds, working as an intern architect and then kind of wanting to explore this as an artist. And so it took me a while to kind of navigate that. Like, how do I want to address this? Um, how do I want to address this also at that time working in the profession?
Thank you. Thank you. One of the things that really excited me about this conversation that I was going to have with you has to do with the fact that one of the first projects I ever worked on, I feel like in my curatorial career, was actually an exhibition that I organized. It must have been at this point, wow, we're going on 15 years ago, 16 years ago. And it was
Okay.
called the gentrification. It was called the gentrification of Brooklyn. And so I'm from
Mm.
Brooklyn, New York originally. And so as you know, in your profession, um, Brooklyn was one of those let's call it a city, sort of like ground
Hmm.
zero for gentrification, some 15, 20 years ago. And in many ways you could say still is, because there are a lot of neighborhoods deeper into the borough that have not undergone the sort of drastic changes that you see in neighborhoods like Bed-Stuy and Fort Greene, and other areas like Williamsburg, Greenpoint, etc. I
Hmm.
bring this up because I bring this up because not only is a subject like gentrification kind of deeply connected to your work. I found it to be really fascinating when that opportunity was presented to me to organize that show. That I sort of had to figure out how to look at gentrification through the lens of art. And then I also thought it was almost ironic that that I had to do that because artists have historically been the harbingers of gentrification in
Hmm.
certain neighborhoods throughout the United States. So I thought it was a very interesting, almost paradoxical situation that I was organizing an exhibition about gentrification and working with artists to articulate that, artists that were from neighborhoods like Bushwick and Bed-Stuy and Crown Heights, and all of those neighborhoods and then some have undergone the kind of drastic changes in the past 15 years that in some ways they become almost unrecognizable to people who are from my parents' generation. And so I imagine you've experienced sort of that similar complexity of being a visual artist and working in communities that are undergoing these kinds of changes, knowing what role artists can sometimes play both for the good and also perhaps even for the
Hmm.
bad in these changes. I mean, I'd love to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, it's funny. Yeah, I spent a lot of time kind of dealing with that in terms of just researching it and still in the process of researching it. And it's interesting because artists have always kind of found themselves in kind of like the crosshairs of gentrification. When you think back to you think about the date escapes me, but the white flight, when a lot of people moved out of the city into the suburbs and those industries kind of moved out, you had those empty factories like in lower Manhattan. And that's where a lot of artists, found spaces that were cheap where they can retrofit it for their lifestyle. It became their studio, and then it became their homes. And then that it became the thing where, okay, this is where the artists are, then this is where the gallery should be. And then let's now, from going to the work in the gallery, let's go and actually visit the artist's studio. And then all of a sudden other things start coming in, more galleries, more, the coffee shops, and then next thing you know, people want to live in lofts, like the artists do. And so it just and it's interesting because you know you find you find it very interesting how art has kind of sometimes been kind of used like that in certain situations. And it's hard because it's a great opportunity, but you want to make sure that the intention of why that opportunity is there is meaningful for the community and also meaningful for the artist community as well. And so yeah, there's been a lot of things in terms of like looking into that. There's an amazing, I don't know if you've ever seen this, mentioned that you're from Brooklyn. There's this amazing documentary called Gut Renovation by Sue Frederick, and she talks about Williamsburg. And she spends, I think, maybe 5 or 6 years just documenting like the changes in Williamsburg, in the Brooklyn neighborhood. And it's hilarious, but it's also very sad because it also talks about how those artists in those factories, or sometimes how they're pushed out. They're working as artists in that artist community, that putting in that sweat equity to change a vacant building into a place where an incubator for artists. And depending on, she talks about one situation where um, somebody, I think the city said there was a gas leak. And so they were able to get into that building and look and actually see, okay, this is zoned for industry, but you got people living in here. And then boom, they hit the landlord or the building owner with a fine saying you have to make these adjustments. You have to make these renovations. And of course they can't do it. And so they end up selling, and then boom, the building's gone. And then next thing you know, you have a condo that kind of goes up there. And so it's just always interesting how art has always played a role in gentrification. Um, I don't want to say intentionally, but it just always there's always a role in there. So yeah, I have definitely definitely dealt with that a lot. Um, with some of the public art that I've done, and particularly, some of the projects I've gone after have been in communities that have gone through transition. And I think for me, I think the reason why I want to be able to do some of those projects is because I want the story of that community to be permanent somehow. I want the story to um, continue on. And if I understand that people, move in that community, but the foundation, you need to understand the foundation and the shoulders that you stand on. There have been people that have been there for 50 years that have put in a lot of pride and a lot of time into those communities. And you need to understand and respect that space that you live in there. You can't just move in there because of proximity and frequency. It's close to close to downtown or close to your job or close to public transportation. But you got to really understand that. So for me, when it comes to like going after certain projects like that, I want to make sure, like, listen, we got to tell the story. We got to tell the truth of why this community is so strong and why this community means so much to so many people. And so it's there's a lot of different ways we can go in terms of like discussing, like, as an artist, dealing with that piece of gentrification and in communities in transition.
Thank you. So, every time I ask you a question, you give me an answer, then I think of like five more things I want to ask you. First of all, thanks for the recommendation on gut renovation. I have not seen the documentary, but I also
Yeah.
have a recommendation for you, or perhaps you've already read it. There's a book called $500 House in Detroit.
Okay.
And it came out several years ago, obviously around the time when everyone was talking about Detroit. And
Hmm.
that's another city, very, very charged situation. I have a lot of friends in and from Detroit. And so I've heard different versions of Detroit's history over the years from different people, people who know what they're talking about, and people who I wonder if they know what they're talking about. But nevertheless, I bring up that book because I also think about capitalism as it relates to the things we've been discussing, and
Right.
capitalism in the context of visual art, and capitalism in the context of real estate. And I'll be frank with you, sometimes I struggle with certain ideas philosophically because, on the one hand, I believe that if someone is working really hard and they have the opportunity to sort of benefit from their labor financially, by all means, they should do that. But I also have a deep seated belief in something you mentioned, and that is, well, you didn't use these words, but I think this was the sentiment, that there is a responsibility that we have to other people, whether they are friends, family, or strangers. And I think the responsibility of decency and fairness, a responsibility of like respecting the history of a place that
Hmm.
predates you. But at the same time I also know that we are part of a generation of people who, at least in America, are being told, certainly by the media, that it's a win or lose situation from a capitalist standpoint. And if you don't win, then you lose, right? It's this almost
Right.
zero sum game mentality. And so, just shifting gears a little bit, talking a little bit, I guess, more about art. How have you thought about that in the context of being a visual artist who has shown with galleries, I'm sure aspires for even more? I mean, I don't want to be presumptuous, but I assume, like most visual artists, you aspire for even more exposure. Perhaps that means even more sales. Perhaps that means, representation with bigger galleries and all the things that come along with, the capital existence of a visual artist. And how does that relate to how you view um, these communities, and how you view some of the things you've spoken about? I'm sorry if I'm getting too heady here, but I just want
No, you're
to
fine.
get into this sort of like dual existence, that not only you have. I mean, it's certainly not just you. I would say I even have the same dual existence of wrestling with my values, but also as it relates to my responsibilities.
No, I definitely understand that. I think for me, when it comes to being an artist, I think the first part of it is wanting to tell a story. I think that's the first thing that's kind of always kind of like been my guiding, I guess my guidepost, if you will. Like, what story am I telling? Why am I telling this story? Um, it's definitely not to, you don't want to get into the idea of like, okay, I'm telling a story to make money. That's, that's like that's when you get to like the ethical part of like, I can't, for me, I can't do that. But then there is that double sided, that there's the other part of like, okay, you want to get your story out there. There are different ways of doing that. There are different ways, different opportunities of doing that. And I think trying to explore that, as an artist, where, you have shows where people can kind of come and view your work. And then when it comes into the purchasing of the work, it's like, okay, all right, how am I going to negotiate this with myself, in terms of doing something where, yeah, I want to continue to tell a story. I want people to be aware of it. um but then also as well, there's a business side of it. Like, how am I negotiating that, and then how do I kind of like balance that, like, with my ethics and my feeling. For me, and I'm not saying this is always the right way, I'm sure there's other ways of doing it. For me, I've thought about in terms of like, who owns my work. I want there to be a range for anybody to be able to, purchase, my work, on all various levels. um but I want them to understand why I'm doing while I'm telling the story. I think the public art aspect of me, I think that's where, for me, where I kind of like, I think that's where it's more like a community base, because it gives me an opportunity to work with the community, and it gives me an opportunity. For me, I feel like it's 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 less than me and more about the community, because I think a lot of people want to be heard, in terms of, they want to be able to tell their story and tell the narrative of their community, and they want it to be conveyed in a way that's respectful and that honors them. And I think for me, that's for me how I kind of navigate that when it comes to public art. It's about the public, it's about the community. And so I think that's how I kind of navigate that. It is something I've definitely worked on. So I apologize if it sounds more basic than, because it's been more of a feeling for me in terms of how to navigate that than I've ever had to really kind of like, to verbally convey. So I apologize if it sounds that way, but I've often have to kind of navigate that. And I think that at a certain point, okay, what am I doing? Am I doing it for the right way? Am I making the impact that I want to make? Um, and I have to kind of pivot if I need to, if that makes sense. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but
No, you definitely
those are
answered
just.
my question. You definitely did, and I, as I said before, then it just like leads to more questions. Uh, um, so one thing I wanted to talk a little bit about, and you just touched on this, has to do with like the role art can play in terms of potential like asset building, wealth creation. I mean,
Mhm.
certainly, look, I'll be the first one to tell you, I know that art is an expensive practice and it's an expensive endeavor to be a full-time artist, and I say that because I don't think people talk about that enough. The opportunity cost to be an artist, if you want to be a full-time artist and even if you have a side job, is huge. And so
Yeah.
you're paying for materials, you're paying for, in some cases, a studio, you're paying for a lot of things that you may or may not see any kind of immediate return from. So that inevitably adds up and makes it a very expensive career pursuit. Some might argue, well, it's a choice, but for some creative people, it's not much of a choice at all because that is who you are and that's what you must do. That's where your not only your heart but your soul and your mind has led you, and you would actually
Mhm.
almost you would suffer and perhaps even die intellectually if you were to do something else. So I do believe that there are some people who are meant to be artists and they must pursue that. And but they must also endure all of the sacrifice and pain that comes with that decision. It is life, right?
Yeah.
But if you're fortunate enough to be able to turn that decision into a career that makes money for yourself, for your family, etc., then you're in a position to, in some cases, create more wealth for yourself than you could ever with like a 9 to 5 or some other kind of job. If you become a successful artist, I mean, as you know, sky's the limit if you're able to do that, and not everyone is able to do that. But once you get to the point where there is a demand for your work, and there's a lot of commercial interest in what you're doing as a Black artist in America, and I'll focus in on Black artists, even though this does apply to artists from other ethnicities for sure. But I just want to focus this conversation a little bit on Black artists. Once you get to the position where there's a lot of interest in your work from collectors, institutions, etc., then you will find that the sort of racial wealth divide in America really presents itself very, very clearly to you. Because most of the people, certainly not all, by no means all, but most of the people who are able to buy significant amounts of art are not Black people
You're
financially.
right. Hmm.
Um, and so what happens is, and I've seen this, and I'd love to get your take on this. What happens is that young, emerging, or even mid-career Black artists are often faced with the conundrum of, does it matter who buys my work or not?
Hmm.
Does it matter? Does it matter if my prices go up so quickly that I automatically sort of eliminate any possibility of any young person of color who wants to start collecting to be able to even afford my work? Have you thought about those things, and what do you think?
Yes. And that is I, a lot of thoughts came to mind when you were asking that question. So let me start a little bit in terms of like my journey in terms of making that decision. Um, it is very much it is a hard choice to make to be an artist full time. I will definitely say that, and it's one that I actually fought against for a very long time in being an artist, because you hear being an artist, oh, you're going to be a starving artist. You always hear starving in front of being an artist, and that was actually why I went into school to begin with, to be an architect, to go into architecture, because that made sense. It's still creative. It's still in the creative field. I do love buildings. But that's what I did. But I always said this, and I'm a man of faith. When God has something for you to do, He won't let it go. That's the good thing. The bad thing about it is when God has something for you to do, He won't let it go. And so for me, art kept coming back around. Whether it was like one commission here, one commission there, and it was not until probably 2011 I started really thinking like, okay, maybe I want to do this because it won't something is there, and I don't know what it is. I was doing something within the vein of this work, but I wasn't sure. And I think even for me, wanted to say that I wanted to be an artist, I had to go back to get my MFA so that I can say that I was an artist. If that even makes sense. I'm sure it does to some young artists out there deciding that right now. It's like, I think I need to get my MFA so I can say that I'm an artist. But I that was the track that I did. I still work full time because I have a wife and I have a family. And what I did not want for art, I did not want to be art something that I ended up having I did not want to be mad at what I was called to do, because I love it and I'm passionate about it, and I don't think it's like I'm like in a zone. And so I decided to work full time and going, and it's also going to education as well, because I love that track as well, being an educator. But that for me was like, okay, I'm working. I like teaching art. I have the benefits there. My family's, I'm providing for my family in that way, and then I can do this and I can feel good about it without saying, okay, I have to sell this in order to validate, or I have to sell this and put it in certain shows. So I did that for me so that I could really enjoy painting and doing this. Um, Going to the point of, okay, I'm starting to sell my work and who's buying my work. I think as a Black artist, you definitely, depending on the content that when you're what you're talking about, I think that is a question that you always deal with. Um, who's buying my work? Why are they buying my work? Like, what do you see in my work that may be different than my intentions of what I'm painting? Um, and so, yeah, there have definitely been those times when I have sold my work, and I'm like, man, why? What do they really see in my work? I hope they see, and I think I try to make sure I'm in a position where I can talk about my work. If it's a show, or can it be something where I can say this was my intentions of what I'm painting, so that you understand, that people understand what I'm painting for. And so, yes, I definitely deal with that. I think you asked about things that I've dealt with in my life in that question. So I'm trying to make sure I answer all of them, because it's like, man, it's like flashback all these different moments in my life. So yeah, I do. I think every artist deals with that. Do I still deal with it? I think at times. I think at times, but I think I try to make sure that if there's a show, there's an opportunity for me to talk about my work, so I can be very clear on my intentions, so that you understand the piece that you're getting. So I try to make sure I do that, not so much for the audience, but also for myself, so I can make sure that I'm telling the story myself, so you understand it's clear what I'm doing. Whether it's me talking about it, it's on my website, it's on my Instagram, but I'm telling the story. In terms of people purchasing my work, you know, I don't want to say I'm a collector. I'm very early, really early in the phase. So I know what it's like to want to invest in art. And so there have been people who are collectors who want to invest, and they were like, "Hey, I may not have the money right now for it, but you know, can we work out something?" I was like, "Absolutely, I understand that. I definitely understand that." Because you want them to feel like they're investing in something in your work, and you want to help them along that path. So, for young collectors, I definitely try to help that and encourage that in any way possible. Like, just get started. If you want to collect art, just get started somewhere. It can be if you want the biggest piece, maybe you do have to make installments on it. And I'm not talking about my work, I'm talking about anybody's work. But if it's a sketch, those sketches have intellectual, some type of intellectual property to it. Maybe invest in that, because you're buying, you're supporting that artist, but you're also buying into their process as well. And that could be something that could end up being a beautiful piece of art at some point. Um, so yeah, all those things that you mentioned in terms of the journey of deciding to be an artist, how do you move within that space as an artist? Those are all choices and decisions that I made. Some that I'm very happy about how they turned out. Some I was like, maybe I would have done that a little bit differently had I to do it all over again. But those were all choices, even to the point of where I'm at right now. Those are all choices I made. So
Yeah, yeah. I mean, okay, so I'm gonna admit something to you. I've gone completely off script. Like I started this conversation with like a list of questions I wanted to ask you, and then I realized early on that I really just wanted to have more of a conversation with you to see where
that's
it
fun.
goes, because I'm fascinated by your decision to combine being an architect with being a visual artist, and what that existence is like. Speaking of art, we have some images of your work, so we're gonna put some images on the screen. So, in the
Sure.
interest of time, and then
Okay.
before we conclude today, I also want to come back to this conversation around collecting, because I think it's a fascinating one, and I don't
Hmm.
often get to talk about collecting during these open air conversations because it's
Sure.
usually specifically about the artist and their work. So let's start the images, and what
Hmm.
I'd like for you to do, we have 8 images of your work today, and what I'd like you to do is just take a moment. It doesn't have to be very long. You can just take a minute and just tell me about the work, whether that's the details like the title, dates, all of that, but really like what the inspiration and what you're conveying in the work, what you would like to convey in the work.
Absolutely. So for this particular piece, it's called Align, and really, just talking about um, those communities that have been redlined, and in terms of how that impact is still being felt today. Thinking about in particular, there's a lot of questions that I hear, what do we do about my mom's house or grandma's house? Do we sell it? Um, do we fix it up? Do we live in it? Do we rent it? Do we even own it? Has it been paid off? And so it's those kind of conversations in terms of, what, when it comes to like our elders who live in certain communities, in terms of the family, having that conversation about what do we have to, what do we do with this house? We don't want to sell it. We don't want to give it to a developer, or maybe we do, maybe we do need the money. And so it's those conversations that are happening within families about what happens in a home. When I look at this particular piece right here, two things that that have kind of been constant in my work is the form of the house, that I think unintentionally, I think I started putting it in there, but I realized it just kind of ended up showing up in my work. And then also how I've drawn the figures in my work too. when you do renderings for different renderings when we were in school, you kind of do these little quick figures of people, but the spaces and places that we design, has an impact, if it's going through transition. So what happens to those figures and those people that we draw when that place is going through a transition? And so looking at this, the figure is important to me, the house is important to me, but also the story of the conversation of what do we do with, what do we do with that home that has been a part of our lives for so many years.
Thank you for sharing that. And also, I love the recurring structure, home structure in your work. Because I think in a way, it's, I guess it's safe to say. I mean, the home is like it's a real thing, but it's also so metaphorical, right?
It
It's
is,
this
yeah.
idea. It's this idea of safety. It's also an idea, at least from an American perspective. It's this idea of safety. It's this idea of stability, and also of belonging, and all of these things are kind of all wrapped up into this structure. And then the question is, if someone doesn't have that, how do they deal with those aspects of safety and
Hmm.
stability?
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, no, the idea of home is interesting because I think there was a photography series by Martha Rosler called I used to live here, I believe. And one of the things that she did, she would take pictures of these big billboards, when their new developments come up, and say you could be home now or you live here. And she was taking it, but there was pictures of people who actually already lived in that community. And it's like, what does it mean when, like, you are, telling somebody they could be home now, and it's removing somebody, displacing somebody from their home where they currently live. And so the idea of home is always kind of, what does it mean? It can be something that is, very tangible that we can feel, but it is something that's very, like I said, metaphorical. So, yeah, that definitely shows up a lot in my work.
It's yeah, thank you. And it's interesting because one of my, I mentioned Detroit earlier. So one of my friends who lives in Detroit, one of the things he said, and we shot this little video, and one of the things he said, and it was, in Detroit they don't use, and again, this is one person's opinion, so I'm not trying to say like this is what everyone in Detroit thinks. I'm not trying to say that.
Right.
But
Mhm.
he said, in Detroit we don't use terminology like Renaissance, because that kind of like, erases all of the labor and the work that has already been done in the city for years. That you can't be an outsider and come to a city like that. And again, this is not just about Detroit, but you can't come to a city like that and pretend as though you're putting it on the map.
Right.
Which is the tendency that people have when they go, not so much now. I mean, a lot has changed, but it's the tendency that people would have. I remember years ago, even in Brooklyn, when I was still living there, and this is going back like half my life, so going back, 25 years ago,
Hmm.
there were a lot of conversations that people were like, yeah, I'm gonna come in and I'm gonna do this, and I'm gonna make it a place that's desirable, that people want to come to. And I'm like, desirable? What are you talking about? People
Right.
already are there, and they desire to stay. It's like a
Hmm.
ridiculous thing for someone to say. But anyway, I digress. We had a couple of questions that came in that I want to get to before we run out of time.
Sure.
Where can people go to see your art and possibly purchase it?
So right now, my work is at Elder Gallery. So it's in the south. It's in South End, right off of South Tryon Street. So Elder Gallery has a collection of my work, and then my studio is also in the Bapa Center, Visual and Performing Arts Center, and I believe that's 700 North Tryon Street. And so my studio is there. So just message me and let me know. It's by appointment. But usually on the weekends, there's open studios on the weekends, on Saturdays, and so I'll be there as well.
So obviously people can follow you on social media. We still
Yep.
have time, but I want to get this said before we don't have time. So people can follow you on social media, and obviously they can just search your name on Instagram and other
Yep.
platforms, and find you, Google you, etc. And then the other thing, and let's advance to the next image while I ask this next question.
Sure.
So what medium do you work in primarily, and is there a medium that you haven't explored that you like to delve into?
So right now I'm working in acrylic, and really the reason why I'm loving the acrylic is just because of the pop of color. One of the things that you'll notice about these particular pieces that you're seeing right now, it's funny. A lot of people are like, oh, you know what? When I had a show, they were like, I love the colors. I love the primary colors. They're so bright. Um, and it's interesting when I tell them, I was like, it was inspired by red. The colors were inspired by redlining maps, and to kind of see that reaction is very interesting to see, because when you look at redlining maps, the red are the areas that are hazardous. The yellow is the ones that are in decline, and the blue is the ones that are a little bit more the ones that are more desirable. And so when I kind of say that, then you start looking at where the pieces are, where the demographics are in my work. And so I've liked working in acrylic just because of how the colors translate. I worked in oil, or worked in mixed media, and I think I always have this love for mixed media, and I think I want to push that a little bit further. And so I see myself kind of going back to that, especially in some of the pieces that you see a little bit later. But I definitely want to kind of go back and explore that a little bit more, because I feel like it's endless opportunities when it comes to that, and it's an opportunity where you can work in all mediums in mixed medium. Um, so yeah, I definitely want to just kind of dive more back into mixed medium with that.
And I want to just take a moment to talk about redlining. You've mentioned it a few times, and I'm
Mhm.
very familiar with it. I don't want to assume that everyone watching this is as familiar with it as you are. So if we can just take a moment to discuss like what redlining is, I mean briefly, of course, and and
Yeah,
and and why that shows up in your work the way it does.
so it shows up in the work because basically it's when communities are not giving the opportunity, or are basically they do not have um, the investment in those communities, and they're kind of blocked to have those type of investments of communities where you can have things like banks, grocery stores, there's food deserts, and it kind of keeps those areas in decline. And so looking back on looking back in terms of like redlining that has happened in the past, and looking at some of the neighborhoods, and particularly black and brown neighborhoods, and how they were kind of denied those opportunities for investment. That's why I kind of wanted to bring it up into the work and talk about how it kind of impacts today. When you look at some of the colors, like I said before, they when it comes to like city planning, they deem those areas like hazardous, and it's always interesting because I think about our communities in terms of not getting the resources, not getting the support, not having the basic necessities that they need, but yet we're still able to produce doctors, lawyers, teachers, and preachers. And it also just kind of shows what kind of people you have in that community. Because when you don't have those type of investments, or you don't have the amenities that you need, we're still able to produce those people who can go out and make change in the world. And so I wanted to definitely kind of also highlight that as well too, because just knowing the stories of those who lived in some of those communities, and for them to kind of persevere without having it, that's something I really wanted to kind of tell in the story. You mentioned something earlier that it reminded me of something. I can't remember who it was, but it was somebody talking about Brooklyn, and talking about how you can kind of tell when gentrification is coming, because initially you start seeing these small things like bike lanes. You start seeing the trash being picked up on regular days. You start seeing those things, and it's like things that people have been asking for so long. You know, the road all of a sudden gets paved. The street lights are changed, the bulbs are changed. It's those types of things. But when you lived in those redlining districts, that's you didn't have any of that. And so to see it finally start coming, but it coming with the changing of the demographic, I mean, you can just understand the frustration of people that live in that community. We've been asking for this for so long, but yet you're doing it, but not for our benefit.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Let's advance to the next image, and then I want
Sure.
to continue on what you were just saying. So let's do it in this order. share a bit about the work we're looking at now, and then I'll come back to the question.
Yeah, so this one right here, this was called Cranes in the Sky. And of course, there's a song called Cranes in the Sky, which I was listening to when I painted this piece. But interestingly enough, this particular piece I had been inspired by actually some work that I saw at the Gantt Center. I think that's part of your collection. It was the Brook Hill, Welcome to Brook Hill Village. And I think Alvin Jacobs shot a lot of that work. But it's just, looking at the homes in those communities and then seeing all of a sudden these buildings and these massive cranes going up next to them, kind of juxtaposed to one another. It's just one of the things that's like, it's when you kind of sit and look at that, it's like, what are people who were still there at that time seeing that, like, what are they feeling, what are they thinking, and hearing that somebody has bought where you live, or bought the area that you live in, and that question of the unknown of where you're going to go, and then actually seeing it kind of like almost kind of coming down the street towards you. So that's where that particular piece came from, for what that this piece was inspired by.
Thank you. We had a question that came in. I think you began sort of talking about this subject in some ways, and the question was, in your opinion, like, how does gentrification affect education of students? And you started going down that road a little bit, but maybe you can take a moment and let me know what you think about that.
When you're talking about students, I mean, there's so much to talk about there in terms of what certain schools are not getting. And that's having that conversation without where we currently are right now, in terms of just the teacher shortage. But um, you talk about, just not having, the amenities within a school system. If they have the most current books, if the school is in terms of, has what it needs in terms of just the support from its faculty, from the school system, the food, in terms of like, what students are being fed, like it definitely impacts, the education in terms of what, students are not getting, and again, I'm trying to have that conversation now without the particular climate that we're in right now, where we have a teacher shortage. It definitely impacts those school communities. And a lot of times those schools end up closing. Some of those schools end up closing, and kids are, sent to other schools. And so it's just, that's one aspect of it. But then there's also the aspect that if a kid or if a family have to move out of a certain area, what school are they going to? Are they still going to that same school? Are they parents having to figure out a way to kind of get them across town to that school? I think the zoning issue has a lot to do with it as well. So it has a tremendous impact when it comes to education, in terms of how it just impacts the students, and then also the opportunities outside of school, community centers, job opportunities for teenagers and stuff like that. So it definitely impacts the kids.
Thank you for sharing that. So we're coming down to the final 10 minutes, so I'm going to move a little bit more rapid fire. Let's advance to the
Okay.
next image.
Okay.
This
Uh,
is this is a bit different. This is a bit different from the other works.
Yeah, this one I want to say when I started kind of working on this series, this one actually was kind of like my starting piece, if you will, because I was still trying to figure out what to do with the figure. And so you kind of see it kind of morph. It actually changed within this piece. Like, if anything, this is a study piece for me, because I was trying to determine what I wanted to do with my buildings, what I wanted to do with my people, what I wanted to do with the vehicles. And I think a lot of times too, I think we always want to kind of share like we kind of get happy, we want to share the finished work sometimes, or people want to see the finished work. But I also like the transition piece, as well. And I think for me, when I look at this one, this piece was definitely a study piece because I was exploring a lot of different things in there. The themes are still there in terms of the colors, the figures are still there, but you can kind of see how that changes over time. And I think this one actually took me a lot longer because it's a triptych to kind of get done. But the story in this piece is finding uptown, and the idea of you seeing people moving out of a community, but you also seeing people move into the community. You also see the idea of a community. You hear stories about where cabs did not want to take people at one point to their homes, but now all of a sudden there's Ubers and cabs abound, kind of going through there. The one common thing that is also was the public transportation, which the buses always come through there, but now you have Ubers and cabs that are now coming you to these neighborhoods that they did not used to want to go to at one point, or would not drop off people before. So this one is for me is a study piece. The technique is a little bit technically it's a little bit different, but it's the piece that kind of lends to the other pieces that we just showed a few minutes ago.
That's great. That's great. I think we have three more images. Let's advance to the next image.
Sure. This one I did actually after that one, and this again is more so a transition piece, and it's called In Transition, ironically. But you're seeing here businesses where they're saying we've moved, we've closed, and then you're also starting to see new businesses or new homes starting to pop up saying welcome, welcome home, welcome to this community. There was a line in that documentary that I loved that I think about when I did this piece, that she said, Sue Frederick said, she said it was my home until they welcomed me to it. And so what is the idea of like this new neighborhood kind of all of a sudden welcome you home and you've been there for so long? And so you definitely see that in there. You definitely see the new construction and the screen and the cranes in the background. So for this piece was kind of like definitely moving and transition into that to the work that I have now, the body of work that I have now.
That's great. That's great. I love it. We have two more, and I'd love to get to them and still have a couple more minutes to ask you questions. And again, so this work, again, quite different than what we've seen before,
Yep.
much more
So this
abstract.
much more abstract. And if you want to advance to the next one, I can talk about these two at the same time. So
Sure,
these
sure.
pieces were actually what I did before um, the paintings that I did now. And again, the home has always kind of been a central figure in all of my work. And so what you're seeing actually on this piece is you are seeing Monopoly houses that I've used in here. And so the Monopoly houses, you think about the Monopoly game, you think about, the changing in terms of like an area that you lived in, the idea of home, this has been your home for so long, but there's that idea of losing that house. And so these pieces are a little bit more abstract in terms of kind of telling the story of, neighborhoods that have been kind of in transition, neighborhoods that were kind of looked at as being, in decline. But those were homes, those were lives, those areas needing support to support the families that live there, that community. So that one kind of really that's what these pieces are really about. If you advance to the next one, I can tell you this one you can't really see the homes, but there are four homes that are in there. The reason why I did this particular piece, this again was inspired by when I was walking around that day in Cherry. And I was talking to a woman who had lived there for some years, and she was talking about, we have these new homes now. These, we have people that are moving into this community, and she always felt that once these homes go up, the gates go up, and she's like, I'm used to a community where I know my neighbor. If they're sick, I can go over there and I can check on them, or they can come and check on me, or I know just different people in the community. But here, once these homes go up and these fences go up, the first thing that's up there are these signs saying "keep out," and it's like, who are you trying to keep out? Like it feels like you're trying to keep me out of my own neighborhood. And so that's what was the inspiration for this particular piece. So I just I went around and looked at the different signs that were up, no trespassing, keep out. And I just kind of took those signs and cut those up and collaged. And then I have the four homes in there kind of representing what's left of that community and how they actually felt in that community.
That's yeah, it leads me. It's great, and it leads me to some other questions that we certainly don't have a lot of time for. But um, I do want to ask you one more question, and that is, and
Sure.
it kind of connects to collecting, because I said we'd come back to that.
Hmm.
Why is it important to you? Why is it important to you that someone who collects your work understands what the work is about?
I feel like when you create work, it, you are telling a story, something that's something personal to you. And so if anybody collects my work, I want to make sure that they understand maybe what I was kind of going through at that time or what I was thinking about at that time for that work. I want them to have a clear understanding for it. It's fine if you see something in there that resonates with you. I completely understand that and I respect that. And I think that's part of the exchange between a collector and their artwork. But I also want them to understand what I was kind of thinking about as well. I think so often, a lot of times we read in the history books of artists, there's this kind of like, this interpretation of their work. But now I think we have this opportunity where I can let you know what my intentions were behind my work. And so that if there's an opportunity for us to talk and have a conversation, I can let you know you don't have to interpret it. I can tell you what it is. I also, want to see what you see in it and see if maybe it aligns with what my intentions behind it. I want to kind of have that dialogue. So I think for anybody who collects my work, I love having conversations with people. A lot of times with shows, I don't even tell people I'm the artist. I kind of like walk up behind them and hear them talk about it. then and they kind of chime in like, yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking, or kind of saying that's exactly, I like having that exchange, and I feel like that adds to the work as well when we as artists can share personally what our intentions were behind the work.
Thank you, thank you. I wanna end our conversation. I never do this, but there was a quote. There's a James Baldwin quote that's been floating around in my head, and an artist friend of mine actually recently posted it on Instagram, and I'm going to share it, and I'm not going to try to do it from memory at all. I'm just going to read it because I think it kind of connects to some of the things we talked about today. And the quote is, and again, this is James Baldwin. The best advice I ever got was an old friend of mine, a black friend, who said, "You have to go the way your blood beats. If you don't live the only life you have, you won't live some other life. You won't live any life at all." That's the only advice you can give to anybody. And it's not advice, it's an observation that you have to go where your blood beats, go to where your blood beats. And I think that that is what you've done with your work. And I really appreciate the thoughtfulness and how you've connected these different disciplines in a very meaningful way, and also how you've remained rooted in community and understanding that as an artist, um, there is a responsibility that you have to yourself, but also to the others around you. And that's just fantastic. So I'm so grateful for today's conversation. And I have to do the closing words. I actually have 10 more questions I'd love to ask you, but unfortunately, all good things must come to an end.
Yeah.
So I really want to, tell you that this has been really rewarding for me, Stacy. And so, as usual, my final words: the Gantt Center's goal is always to provide programs that inform and inspire. The support of viewers like you allows the Gantt to expand its reach and further develop programs like Open Air. Lend your support to the Gantt Center by texting "Give to Gantt" to 91999. That's give the number 2 Gantt to 91999. Also, be sure to like and subscribe to this channel for future programs and other video content updates. We thank you for joining us for another great conversation, and we look forward to next month's Open Air. Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.